This is the fourth lecture video for the biological molecule module. So the first video was on dehydration and hydrolysis reactions. Second video was on carbohydrates. The third on proteins. And now this is the fourth lecture video on nucleic acids. Now this is a group of biological molecules just like proteins and carbohydrates. So for this group, you need to be able to identify the monomer of a nucleic acid. You need to identify the two nucleic acids that I'm going to discuss and the function of DNA. So just a reminder, the monomer of a carbohydrate, it's also called a monosaccharide or simple sugar, and that is glucose, fructose, and galactose. The monomer of a protein is an amino acid. Many amino acids together form a polypeptide. So let's move on to nucleic acids. So what I'm showing you here is DNA in two different forms. So this first picture is showing you DNA as a double helix. Now, this is the form that DNA takes. Now, when I say double helix, what I'm talking about is that there are two strands of DNA and they form this spiral or helix structure. So if you look at the picture here, this would be a strand of DNA and this is the other strand. Now, I'm asking you on this slide what the monomer of a nucleic acid is. So I'm going to type that out for you. It is called a nucleotide. Okay, so the monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. So let's look at this other picture of DNA on the right-hand side. Now, DNA is a bunch of nucleotides attached to each other with covalent bonds. So your nucleotide is right here. Okay, that is a nucleotide. So here is another nucleotide and another. Now, those nucleotides, notice I circled them all going down on one column. That is one strand of DNA. Now, the other strand of DNA is right here. There's a nucleotide. Here's a nucleotide. Here's a nucleotide. Now, again, those nucleotides are linked to each other with covalent bonds. But here's something unique about DNA. This strand of DNA is linked to this strand right here in the middle. These dotted lines are hydrogen bonds. Now, remember, hydrogen bonds are very weak. And the reason that they are in between those two strands is so that DNA can be separated when your cell is making more DNA. And we will get into that in later lessons. So the monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. Now, DNA and RNA are both nucleotides. There is another nucleotide, but you will learn about that later. I'm sorry, not nucleotides, nucleic acids. DNA and RNA are nucleic acids. The nucleotide is what makes them up. So here we have a close-up picture of a nucleotide. And your nucleotide has three components or parts that you need to know. So first of all, we have a phosphate group. Now I want you to notice here that this phosphate group is charged. So this oxygen and this oxygen have a negative charge. Now, remember that a negative charge means that oxygen has an extra electron. It stole it from a different atom. Now, we start with a phosphate group. Then there is a sugar. Now, it says 5-carbon sugar, and this is correct. But if you just remember sugar, I'll be happy. And then finally, we have a base. Again, it says nitrogenous base, meaning it has nitrogen. But what I really care about is that you know it's a base. So I'm going to write this for you here. So I asked you, what are the components of a nucleotide? I want you to remember that there are 3 components. 3 components of a nucleotide. So the first one, just remember phosphate group, sugar, base. Phosphate, sugar, base. Those are the 3 parts to a nucleotide, which again is the monomer of a nucleic acid. Okay, so now we're going to look at this a little bit more in depth, and you will get this information again in later lessons. So one of the things you need to know about nucleic acids is the function of DNA. So DNA stores genetic information. Now I want you to take a second and think about where DNA is located inside of the cell. Remember, we went over cell structure. So DNA is stored in the nucleus of the cell. Now this is only eukaryotes, remember. Prokaryotes like bacteria do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. In prokaryotes, it's in the nucleoid region. That just means it's really dense in the middle of the bacterial cell. Now here I'm asking you what the differences are between DNA and RNA, and there are actually 3 differences that you need to know. So first of all, let's look at these bases. DNA has 4 different bases. So I'm going to write this here for you. So if you look at my picture, here we have thymine, that is a base, cytosine, guanine, and adenine. Those are the bases in DNA. Now I'm going to take a step back and go to one of my previous slides because I want you to see or to relate this to the structure of a nucleotide. So here we have the nucleotide. Let's see if I can erase some of these red marks here. Oh, I can't. Okay. Let me erase this black marks here. Okay. So we were talking about the 4 bases in DNA. So what I want to show you here is the components of a nucleotide, remember, are a phosphate, a sugar, a base. Now, the base can be either adenine, guanine, cytosine, or thymine. Now, that is in DNA. And I'm going to write that here for you. Just because there's not enough room on my other slide. So 4 bases in DNA. Okay, we have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. You do need to remember these names. So when you're looking at a nucleotide, that base can be one of those 4 different types of bases. Now, I was asking you the differences between DNA and RNA. So remember, RNA is made up of a nucleotide as well, because they are both nucleic acids. But one difference between RNA and DNA is with the bases. So RNA also has 4 bases, and 3 of them are the same as DNA. So we have adenine, guanine, cytosine. These are the same as DNA. But for RNA, there is no thymine. Instead, there is a base we call uracil. And this will become important in a later lesson. So now I'm going to go back to the slide we were on about the differences between DNA and RNA. Okay, so one of the differences is that DNA has thymine and RNA has uracil. So one difference, DNA has thymine, RNA has uracil. Now the second difference, and if you look at these pictures of DNA and RNA, you should be able to tell the second difference. But DNA is double-stranded. RNA is single-stranded. Okay, so DNA, if you look at the picture, you see 2 of those strands winding around each other. RNA only has 1. And then the final difference is with the sugar. DNA has deoxyribose sugar. RNA has ribose sugar. And so if you think about DNA, it stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid, referring to the sugar. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, talking about the sugar. And the only difference between these sugars is ribose has 1 extra oxygen. So they both are still 5-carbon sugars. Okay, so that concludes nucleic acids. So remember that the monomer of a nucleic acid is the nucleotide. DNA and RNA are nucleotides. A nucleotide is made up of a phosphate sugar base. Okay, now know the function of DNA is to store genetic information. And remember from the protein lesson that only about 5% of your DNA are actual genes. The rest of your DNA does other things. Finally, you need to know the 3 differences between DNA and RNA. So DNA has a thymine base, RNA has uracil. Both of them have adenine, guanine, cytosine. DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. And then finally, DNA has deoxyribose sugar, RNA has a ribose sugar. Next, I will be doing the lipid lecture video, which will conclude this whole series of biological molecules.